If you've been a PC gamer for a while, then one truth should already be crystal clear to you. It's almost always better to build your gaming PC yourself instead of buying a pre-built one. At least if you want to make sure you're getting your money's worth, and I mean, who doesn't? You'll always be able to pack your custom-made PC with superior specs than a pre-built PC that costs the same will have. So why let the store rip you off? Why not just build your own PC? There are usually two answers to this. The first one is, I did build my own PC, stop judging me YouTube channel, you don't know me. If you count yourself among the first category, then props to you. Keep fighting the good fight. You might still learn something interesting in this video, so don't tune out. But what you should do is take a look at the video description because we've packed it full of useful links to our guide on buying the best, well, everything, from hardware to peripherals. The other, and more common answer to this question is usually something along the lines of, well, I don't want to mess something up, I've never done this before. We get it. Building a PC can sound very daunting, but believe us when we say that the hardest step is deciding that you're going to do it. After that, everything just kind of falls into place. And besides, that's why we made this video. Here at Gaming Scan, we deem it our mission to make sure our fans and followers have the best gaming experience they can, and we're always looking to point out the most cost-effective solution for everything. So just stick with us, and you'll be fine. So with that out of the way, let's begin. We'll start with what we call the primary components. These are your hardware pieces that every PC simply must have in order to operate. The CPU, GPU, motherboard, RAM, storage, and power supply. Let's look at the CPU first. It is, after all, called a central processing unit for a reason. You can think of it like the brains of your PC. All the data that needs to be processed goes through the CPU, and it tells the other components what to do and when to do it. It's kind of like the boss among the hardware pieces, or the manager if you will. Now when choosing a CPU, the first thing you'll need to do is opt for the brand. The choice is rather binary here. You could go with Intel or AMD. Up until recently, Intel was the hands down better pick, but after AMD's comeback with the Ryzen series of processors, they're quite evenly matched. So we'll leave the brand decision to you and instead focus on how powerful a processor you should buy. If you're buying a low-end or a lower mid-range PC, then it's best to go with either the Intel Core i3 or the AMD Ryzen 3 CPUs. And if you're building an upper mid-range or a high-end PC, then you should definitely get an Intel Core i5 or an AMD Ryzen 5 CPU. And that's pretty much that. You'll hear about people using all sorts of more powerful processors to prevent bottlenecking, but trust us when we say you don't need them for gaming. Bottlenecking is what happens when your GPU is disproportionately more powerful than your CPU. But remember how we said that the CPU is the brains of the whole operation? Well, the GPU is just a laborer in it, and it will only render what the CPU orders it to render and when it tells it. So if your CPU isn't strong enough to get the most out of your GPU, then the GPU just won't work at full capacity. A part of it will just be sitting idly. And we get it, no one wants this to happen to them, but it's easy to get paranoid about it. An i5 or a Ryzen 5 CPU will be more than good enough to prevent bottlenecking. In fact, they'll just barely bottleneck a GTX 1080 Ti. The only reason you should get an i7 or a Ryzen 7 is if you're planning on running multiple high-end GPUs. It'd just be a waste of money, and you're better off investing that money into something else, like the monitor or the GPU. Speaking of which, we may have called the GPU just a laborer in the hardware hierarchy, but it's still the most important piece of hardware for gaming. It's actually more important than the CPU. It handles all the in-game graphics rendering. So while a dedicated graphics card isn't a requirement in all PCs, the ones that are used just for multimedia and browsing can work just fine with an integrated graphics chips that CPUs and some motherboards have. You'll definitely need a dedicated graphics card for gaming. Now before we get any deeper into this discussion, we have to highlight one distinction. A GPU and a graphics card are not the same thing. People use them synonymously, we've used them synonymously, and that's okay, but it's important to know what the differences are. The GPU is merely a processor part like Nvidia and AMD make, but the graphics card is the final product that other manufacturers like Asus or Gigabyte put out on the market with all other parts that it needs to have, like the VRAM for instance. So which GPU should you get? Like we've said, Nvidia and AMD are the two big GPU manufacturers, but the playing field here isn't nearly as even as it is in the CPU market. Nvidia produces all kinds of GPUs, but AMD sticks to low-end and mid-range GPUs. So if you're building a high-end gaming rig, then like it or not, you have to run an Nvidia GPU. For mid-range and lower-end gaming PCs, you can also consider AMD GPUs. There are other options, of course, but we think that these present the best value. Like we've said, cost efficiency is something we're very concerned with here at GamingScan. But even if you choose a different GPU, make sure to run it through the user benchmark first. It may not be the most reliable source for benchmark results, but it'll definitely give you a good impression of how well the GPU will perform compared to others. So now that we know GPUs and graphics card aren't the exact same thing, we also have to consider which graphics card you should get. Nvidia and AMD produce the GPUs, but there are many seasoned hardware manufacturers that make graphics cards out of them. Some, like Asus, Gigabyte, or MSI, work with both brands, while others, like EVGA and Zotac, or XFX and Sapphire, only make one brand of graphics cards. So what differs between manufacturers, you ask? Well, pretty much everything. From circuit board size and shape, to the trivial stuff like color and the appearance of the card, to the really important stuff like cooling solutions and VRAM capacity. These last two are things that should influence your decision the most, so let's dissect them. There are three cooling solutions that modern graphics cards use: open air cooling, blower fan cooling, and water cooling. The first type is the most common and the most efficient type of cooling in most cases. It relies on anywhere between 1 and 3 fans to push air through open heat sinks. In our honest opinion, it's best to stick with open air cooling. There's a reason it's so widespread. Besides, some smaller stores often only sell graphics cards with this type of cooling, so just getting your hands on one or the other two could be a hassle. But let's take a look at what they're all about. Blower fan cooling is the type that uses only one fan and a closed heatsink. The fan blows the hot air out of the back of the card, which makes it very good for smaller cases, but it won't benefit from case-mounted cooling. Although there are people who get blower fan graphics cards just because of how cool they look. And then there's water cooling. It's a bit more complex than air cooling, and we won't get into the details here, but if you'll take our word on it, you should only consider water cooling if you're planning on getting both a high-end graphics card and overclocking it. And last, but certainly not least, there's the question of VRAM capacity, the card's very own random access memory used exclusively for graphics processing. Back in the day, VRAM was very important for high-resolution textures, but nowadays we talk about it mostly in the context of the overall resolution. And as things stand, 4GB cards are more than good enough for 1080p. If you have your sights set on 2K or 4K resolutions, however, then you'll need to get at least a 6GB or an 8GB graphics card. If some of this is becoming too hard for you to follow, don't worry about it. Like we've said, we'll leave a bunch of links in the description that all lead to our buying guides on the various hardware and peripherals, and naturally, there's one for graphics cards as well. The RAM is used to store information that the PC needs to access quickly. It's used for this because it's much faster than any form of storage currently available, even SSDs. It's ridiculously fast. The downside to this is that RAM memory needs to be powered up to store information, and it loses all data when the power goes out. All RAM modules use the latest DDR4 technology right now, which is great for us. One less thing to worry about. So the only thing to consider here is the capacity. How much RAM do you need for gaming? In our opinion, 8GB is the minimum amount today. It should run all games smoothly unless they're poorly optimized, and it's the most cost-effective solution. Getting 16GB is recommended. You definitely don't need anything more than this right now. Not for gaming at least. But we're here to talk about building a gaming PC, not a workstation. The last thing to consider when it comes to RAM is the module's operating frequency. For DDR4, these range from 2133 MHz to 3200 MHz. Although you can find extremely fast modules that go up as high as 4600 MHz, but you don't need these. They're much more expensive and they won't lead to better frame rates. Not enough to justify the price anyway. If the CPU is the head of your PC and the other pieces of hardware are the limbs, then the motherboard is the torso that's keeping them all connected. It takes all the separate pieces of hardware and turns them into a functional whole. So while it doesn't impact gaming performance directly, you'll have to make sure that all the separate pieces are compatible with your motherboard, and you'll want a motherboard that can support all the components you want, not just the primary components, but the secondary ones as well. More importantly, you'll need to make sure that your motherboard has the right chipset type and the right socket type, because these will determine which CPU you can plug in. Sockets aren't that big a deal because both Intel and AMD use the same socket for all their mainstream CPUs. Intel uses the LGA1151 and AMD uses the AM4 socket. But not all newer chipsets are backwards compatible, so you'll definitely want to look up the details of each chip's specifications. We'll leave some useful links for this as well in the description. What's more, you'll also have to decide on the motherboard's format, which will also determine how much RAM and PCIe slots it'll have. At the moment, these are the three most popular formats: Mini ITX, Micro ATX, and ATX. Mini ITX is the smallest of the three, and it has only 2 RAM slots and 1 PCIe slot. Micro ATX is the medium solution, offering 4 RAM slots and 2 to 3 PCIe slots. And then there's ATX, which also has 4 RAM slots but up to 6 PCIe slots. All things considered, we'd have to recommend Micro ATX motherboards for most PCs. The only reason you should get ATX is if you're planning to use 2 GPUs or make good use of the additional PCIe slots. Mini ITX is best avoided, unless your goal is to build the most compact PC. There are also eATX motherboards that support 8 RAM slots and 2 separate CPUs, but you don't need these for gaming. Don't even think about them, or the temptation might corrupt you. Next, let's take a look at which storage you should get for your gaming PC. Here, the choice comes down to HDDs and SSDs. The former are rather inexpensive and have high capacities, while the latter are much faster, but because of this, they cost more and have lower capacities. Our advice is to get both. Use a smaller sub 500GB SSD for your Windows and games, and a terabyte or larger HDD for storing data. The last primary component in a PC is the power supply, or the PSU, and it does just what you'd think it does. It provides the components with power. The best thing to keep in mind here is the wattage. You can find power supplies from anywhere between 200 and 1800 watts, but 500 to 600 will be more than enough for most PCs, unless you're using multiple GPUs. There are different supply formats, but nowadays most cases and motherboards are built with the ATX standard in mind, so you don't have to worry about this too much. What you do have to worry about is where your PSU was manufactured. We highly suggest that you buy your PSU slots from a reliable manufacturer, because a low-end quality power supply can quite literally fry your PC. So if you're planning to cut some corners, don't do it here. We mentioned at the beginning that we would be separating all components into 2 groups: primary and secondary. All the things we've talked about so far were primary components. You simply have to buy all of them for your PC to work. You could technically not buy a graphics card and instead rely on the integrated graphics in your CPU or motherboard, but we're talking about gaming PCs in this video, and this would just be arguing semantics. So all the things we'll list now are secondary components, meaning that you can get them, but you don't really have to. You don't have to get any of these if you don't want to. So let's look at what they are and why you might want to buy them or skip out on them. There used to be a time when computers would be downright useless if they didn't have an optical drive. And given how extremely slow the internet was then and how solid-state drives weren't as advanced, it's understandable why CDs and DVDs were the most popular storage medium. There wasn't really any alternative, but that's just not the case anymore. Even pre-built PCs come without optical drives nowadays. You just don't need them anymore. They've been supplanted not just by the internet, but also by USB flash drives, which can do everything DVDs can and still fit comfortably in your pocket. So the only reason to get an optical drive for your PC is if you already own a whole bunch of CDs, DVDs, or Blu-ray discs that you want to use. Just make sure the drive supports all the formats you want. The ones that are compatible with Blu-ray discs are on the more expensive side, but they're a worthwhile investment if you need them. Let's start this off by saying that all motherboards have integrated chips that can handle audio input and output, and these integrated solutions may have been unreliable in the past, but honestly, modern ones are really good. In fact, they're so good that the only reason you should ever buy a dedicated sound card is if you want a proper 5.1 or 7.1 surround experience. But if you're planning on using a stereo configuration, either 2.0 or 2.1, then there's absolutely no need to buy a sound card. Although it is quite convenient that you can just buy a sound card if the integrated one should fail. You won't need to replace the whole motherboard just so long as you have enough PCIe slots. Speaking of which, much like with the sound cards, all the expansion cards are largely unnecessary in that the motherboard should usually have built-in functionalities for all of them. And because you only have so many PCIe slots, do make sure that you only buy the expansion cards that you really need. And the last thing we want to include in this category are case-mounted fans. They're entirely optional, although we do suggest using at least one, if not two, as they can go a long way in improving the airflow inside your case. And this is especially important if you plan on buying a large graphics card which will generate a lot of heat. Plus, they kind of look really cool, especially if you get the ones with LED or RGB lighting. And who doesn't want a cool looking case? Now, once you've picked out all your primary components and whatever secondary components you want, you'll have to fit them all in a computer case. Computer case formats are based around motherboards, so there are three types of mainstream cases we'll take into consideration. Mini tower designed for mini ITX motherboards, micro tower for micro ATX motherboards, and mid tower for ATX motherboards. There's also a full tower case designed for eATX motherboards, but while you really shouldn't buy an eATX for gaming, there's nothing stopping you from getting a full tower case just to make your PC look more intimidating. But the motherboard isn't the only thing to consider when deciding on a computer case. You should also keep in mind which graphics card you'll be using. And seeing as it's not all that uncommon for bulkier cards to be too large to comfortably fit into a micro tower, we recommend picking a mid tower just to be safe. It's more spacious, future-proof, and honestly not that much more expensive. And with all of the above taken care of, it's time to turn our attention towards the peripherals. These are all the parts on your PC that are outside the computer case. In this video, we'll be talking about monitors, speakers, headphones, microphones, keyboards, mice, and controllers. So strap in. The monitor is the most important peripheral in general, not just for gaming. You can get away with using any keyboard and mouse, any sound device, and you don't even necessarily need a controller or a microphone. But a monitor is just as necessary as the primary components at the start of the video, and it's arguably even harder to shop for since there are so many aspects to keep in mind. So let's take a look through all of these aspects and briefly explain what they're all about. Size is the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about different monitors. Most modern monitors are generally between 21 and 27 inches in size, and for a good reason. Anything larger than this would be unfit for placing on a desk in front of you. You want to make sure that there's a good viewing distance between you and the monitor. Usually, this is equal to or twice the monitor's diagonal, but it can vary from person to person. Next, there's the matter of resolution. After all, size isn't everything. You want to make sure your monitor size is suitable for its resolution because what we're aiming for isn't just a pixel count, it's pixel density. In PC gaming, you have these three resolutions to consider: 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. 1080p is the most popular resolution and the least hardware demanding. It looks great on monitors up to 24 inches in size, but you shouldn't use it on larger monitors because it's bound to result in some unsightly aliasing. 1440p is the next step in visual clarity, offering visuals that are simply not possible in 1080p. It will look great in monitors of all sizes, but make sure that your hardware can keep up. It takes quite a powerful GPU to push the frame rate close to 60 in 1440p on newer AAA games. And this goes double for 4K. Only the most powerful PCs can handle this resolution, so you should only really consider it if you're building a monstrous gaming rig or if you value image quality that highly. We've mentioned frame rates before, so let's move on to refresh rates right away. A monitor's refresh rate will determine how many times per second the display will refresh. As you can imagine, this pretty much caps your frame rate so that even if your GPU can render 100 FPS, a 60Hz monitor couldn't display that. The three most popular refresh rates in monitors are 60Hz, 144Hz, and 240Hz. 144Hz is the most popular refresh rate for gaming right now, and that's because monitors with this refresh rate will give you a much smoother gameplay than a 60Hz monitor. The difference between a 144Hz and 240Hz monitor is not that noticeable, and you should only go for a 240Hz monitor if you're a very competitive gamer. Response time is measured in milliseconds, and it determines how much time a pixel needs to change from black to white or from one shade of gray to another. This is especially important for gaming because lower response times mean less and ideally no motion blur during camera movements. The monitor's response time will depend on which type of panel it uses, but they can go as low as 1 millisecond. Of course, only competitive gamers need response times this low. For casual gamers, anything in a single-digit territory is fine, but we advise going for 4 millisecond monitor, and we'll explain why in the next segment. Modern gaming monitors use one of these two panel types, twisted pneumatic or in-plane switching. TN panels are the ones that allow for lightning fast response times, but this comes at the cost of color accuracy and viewing angles. IPS panels, on the other hand, can only go as low as 4 milliseconds, but they deliver much more accurate and vibrant colors and have a much wider viewing angle. Basically, your choice here comes down to preference. Do you value performance or visuals more? However, we think that TN panels are only useful for competitive gamers who need every edge that they can get. For casual gamers, the extra 3 milliseconds of response time is a low price to pay for a much superior image quality. If you can't quite make up your mind, vertical alignment panels, or VA for short, present a middle ground between TN and IPS panels. They don't reproduce color quite as accurately as IPS panels do, but they can offer better performance and superior contrast. Obviously, they outclass TN panels when it comes to visuals, although only the more expensive VA monitors are able to come close to the performance of an IPS panel. And lastly, let's take a look at the connectors. Monitors use HDMI and DisplayPort for video and audio input, and most graphics cards have 3 DisplayPort outputs and a single HDMI output. Some include DVI and VGA, but it's best to stay away from these dated technologies. And in case you were wondering what the differences between DisplayPort and HDMI were, we'll tell you right now. They're actually quite minimal, and they mostly have to do with resolution and refresh rates. Both of these support 4K, but HDMI 1.4 and 2.0 ports supported at 30Hz and 60Hz respectively, while DisplayPort 1.4 supports it at 120Hz. With that said, you probably won't be gaming in 4K at 120 FPS, so feel free to use whichever port is more convenient. They're both backwards compatible, so that's one less thing to worry about. When it comes to audio output, you have the choice between speakers and headphones. Speakers have the advantage of more realistic acoustics and better low-frequency reproductions if you use a subwoofer. Some monitors do come with integrated speakers, but because of their low power output, we can't suggest using these for gaming. The most important thing to consider when deciding on the ideal speakers for you is the configuration you want. There are 4 types of speaker configurations that you can get. First, there's stereo or 2.0. These are the most widespread, and they use 2 speakers on either side. Then there's the 2.1 configuration, which is basically stereo with a subwoofer. The subwoofer is dedicated to producing low-frequency sounds, which makes this configuration particularly popular among gamers. Next, we have the 2 surround configurations, 5.1 and 7.1. Unsurprisingly, these have 5 and 7 speakers respectively, and a subwoofer, and they're all positioned in a way that allows for the best immersion possible. Our advice is to go with 2.1. It's the most cost-effective solution, and it's more than capable of providing immersive full-range sound. Plus, surround configurations can be a real pain to deal with, and they won't offer much benefit unless your room is big enough. We know most people use the term headphones and headset interchangeably, but technically they're 2 different things. They both have on-ear and over-ear headpieces, yes, but headsets also have an integrated microphone. These products are commonly divided into 3 categories: mainstream headphones, studio headphones, and gamer headsets. Mainstream headphones are made for the average consumer, and what we mean by this is that they were specifically designed for gaming, but also for multimedia. They're generally more compact and often foldable to offer better portability. If you've seen a person using headphones on the street, they were most likely mainstream headphones. Then there are studio headphones, and you should definitely not buy these for gaming. They're geared towards professionals and made to provide the best and most faithful sound reproduction. But this means that they can actually take away from the gaming experience. Just think about it. They were made for analyzing sound, not enjoying it. And finally, we have gaming headsets. They strive for a good balance between audio and recording quality, but because the microphone is also included in the price, they're generally more expensive. So with that in mind, our advice is to go with mainstream headphones. Why? Honestly, just because they'll net you the best possible audio quality for the price you're willing to pay. Cost efficiency, and that's what it's all about. Only get a headset if you plan on using the microphone a lot. If not, and you only plan on using the microphone for the occasional online multiplayer, then it's much more cost-effective to just get a dedicated microphone. Or even if you plan on playing a lot of multiplayer but you still don't want to buy a headset. A simple $10 to $20 microphone will serve you just fine for that. And you should only invest in something of higher quality if you plan on streaming as well. When it comes to keyboards, you will have an insane amount of models to choose from, but the biggest choice you'll be making is that between regular membrane keyboards and the more advanced mechanical keyboards. Membrane keyboards are quite simple. They have keys that rest on the top of rubber domes, and when you press the key, the dome collapses and the key makes contact with the circuit board. But mechanical keyboards are a tad more complex. With mechanical keyboards, the keys rest on switches. You also don't need to press the key all the way before the mechanism is triggered and the switch makes contact with the circuit board. There are various types of switches, but the most popular ones are MX cherry switches. They come in various kinds and differ with regards to how much noise they'll make and how hard the keys have to be pressed. Although no matter what switch you get, a membrane keyboard will always be quieter. Still, mechanical keyboards do have the benefit of being more comfortable to use. In the end, it all comes down to preference. Although if you're not sure which ones you should get, then we suggest sticking to membrane keyboards. They're much cheaper and honestly, not everyone will feel the value of mechanical keyboards. The differences between the two can be insignificant or it can mean the world, but it'll all come down to the person using it. Next, we have the mouse. And the situation here is rather similar to that we have with the keyboards. The biggest choice will be deciding on the technology they use. Will you get an optical mouse or a laser mouse? Optical mice are more affordable, but this doesn't mean that they're worse. They're more than fit for gaming. Laser mice are more accurate for sure, but this is both their strength and their weakness. They can be used on every surface, but the laser is so accurate that it often ends up detecting even the most minute details, which can lead to some unwanted jitter. So we definitely think optical mice are the way to go for gamers. Just make sure that you use a mousepad. Additionally, you should choose the model that has the right number of secondary buttons for you. These are the buttons that the mouse will have in addition to the left click, right click, and a clickable scroll wheel. They're very useful for MOBAs and MMOs because you can bind complex macros to them. But even outside of games, you can program them to correspond to a variety of commands. And last but not least, let's look at the controllers. Controllers are more relevant for PC gaming now than they've ever been. Part of this is because most games are developed for consoles and only later ported to PC. And although most of these will technically be playable on the mouse and keyboard, there's no guarantee that they'll be optimized properly. But even if this isn't the case, sometimes games are just more enjoyable to play with the controller. And there you have it, a comprehensive guide on everything you need to know to build a gaming PC. Whew, this was a long one. But hey, if you're going to muster up the courage to build your own PC and enjoy the best game performances for your money's worth, then the least we can do is be thorough for you guys. Just remember, the hardest part is getting started. And as we've said, we've left a whole bunch of links in the description to our guides for deciding on the best model for pretty much everything we've talked about. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section, either here or on the source article. We hope you find this video helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video so that we can keep on making more of these videos. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.